southern West Virginia to rebuild the Appalachian economy.
Thanks, Brandon. Sharon?
Hi, I'm Sharon Danks. I'm the founder of Green Schoolyards America. I'm based in Berkeley, California, and we're working to transform school grounds into parks.
Perfect. Welcome, Sharon. And last but certainly not least, Paula.
Hello, I'm Paula Daniels, and I'm calling in from Los Angeles. I'm co-founder of the Center for Good Food Purchasing, and we're working to transform the food system through the power of procurement of public institutions. I previously worked in a city hall and in government, in the mayor's office and in the state of California, the government of the state of California.
Welcome, Paula. Thank you.
Hi, good to see you all again, especially my Ashoka ABQ friends.
Hey, wasn't that so long ago? We're all together, and now we're here in this cozy digital living room. Thank you all for joining. We'll have different reasons for joining, I'm sure, and this will all come out in the Q&A. But with that, I would love to turn it over to Seth.
Great. Well, it's great to meet all of you, and hoping to get to learn more about your startups too, because it all sounds like very important work. So just a very high level what Democracy Works is and does, and I'll tell you some of my story and how it gets into policy. So Democracy Works at a high level, we want to increase and improve voter participation using technology. And we do all sorts of stuff in order to make that happen, which I'll explain. But just to give you an example, if any of you have ever Googled, where do I vote? Or where is my polling place? All of that data comes from our partnerships with the states, so that it's possible for people to find that information online. And we do other work, like we have a site called Turbo Vote, where we help people vote in all of their elections, and other work that's deeper with a few states as well. But I'll get back to that. So just to back up, it was maybe sort of inevitable I would end up in the voting space in one way or another. I come from like a very political family, not run for office political, but I came from the sort of family where my dad went to every school board meeting in order to yell at the school board, and always talked about politics, local elections, like around, the kitchen dinner table. But I really sort of got into it from a different angle, because I ended up going to grad school because I was really interested. This must have been around 2007 when the internet was changing literally everything, and it was like no longer a fad, clearly. And I was like, well, I should have learned how to code. I sort of wasted my education in college. But I was really interested in why the internet was revolutionizing everything except the public sector, broadly speaking. And so I wanted to go to grad school in order to study that. Like, how do you use this new force in our society? And I got there, but instead of sort of diving right into technology, I started really focusing on how dysfunctional our democracy was, because it felt like, for me, that was the underlying root of so many issues that we weren't solving through policy, we weren't solving through our government. And I felt like at the core of that dysfunction was low voter participation. Like this is just like, I'm studying this from, a theoretical background, and felt like just doesn't matter what party you're in, if turnout in your primary election is 6%, like those people don't represent the will of the people. I come from New York, so for me, my like poster child of dysfunctional democracy are like Democratic primaries with 6% turnout, where it's basically party bosses putting people in charge, and then like 5 legislators go to jail a year. But you can find these. So it's a power vacuum. So like whatever your worry is about what makes a democracy dysfunctional, maybe it's money in politics, maybe it's major billionaire donors, maybe it's like ideological fringe taking over a party, maybe it's like whatever it is, low voter turnout is the power vacuum that makes a democracy dysfunctional. And to make it representative, and so my perspective was like, it has to be issue one. Like whatever I work on, this has to be what I work on first, because you can care a lot about policy, but if the democracy is not working, it's not going to make progress. And so I'm thinking about all this stuff from a very intellectual place. And then I have this epiphany. I'm not really sure what to do with it. I'm just like, yeah, that really matters to me. Not really sure what to do with it. And then I realized that since going to grad school, I had missed 3 elections. And I was like, that's really interesting. These are all different, like, local elections, and I missed each one for a really dumb process issue, like a missed registration deadline, a missed absentee ballot deadline, a missed, and I was like, I'm sure the internet has solved this. Like, this is a dumb problem. Like, let me just sign up for something that will remind me what to do in order to vote in all of my elections. Like, I just need a text message. Just tell me what to do. Like, I'll do it. I'm motivated. I just don't know the things that are necessary. And I even had this experience of, like, on one election day, like, walking by a sandwich board that was like, election day is today. And it was too late. I was like, this is how you find out in a modern democracy that an election is happening. You, like, randomly walk down the right street on the right day and you see a sandwich board. I was like, that's insane. And when I realized that that didn't exist, like, that became what I wanted to do. And so that was back in 2009, like late 2009. And so the reason why I ultimately the way I think this sort of connects with the title of, like, soft power in hard times, like working on policy, is because I felt like this issue was one where policy was most stuck. Where I was even afraid that democracy was too broken for any policy levers to self-correct, because anyone currently in office has no incentive to increase the number of people voting. Like, they got into office just fine the way they did. Like, why would they want to change that equation at all? Like, why mess with a good thing? And again, this is from a bipartisan perspective. Often a lot of these laws are about keeping down primary turnout, or there's all these different little incentives. I felt stuck. So I was like, how do I unstick this? And for me, like, technology was this new third force you could use, and it all sort of clicked together, and we ended up developing this sort of 2-pronged strategy to attack the problem. One that won't sound like policy, but I do think it's helpful in that how it interacts with it. So first was that we decided to build a site called TurboVote, where people would sign up, and then we would help them vote in all of their elections. It's like a very simple premise. It was so much harder to build than we thought. And I can sort of geek out about why that is if anyone's interested in Q&A. But we built that service, and essentially the idea was, no matter what your state's election policy regime is, there is a way where explaining it and educating it to you step by step makes it easier. So, like, the TurboVote works differently in every state because it's a different election law regime, different policy regime, and it's helping you just, whatever the hurdle is, people just need to know what it is in order to overcome it. And so, like, if there are voter IDs, we'll tell you, what they are, what you'll need, how to vote provisionally if you don't have one. If it's, it's early voting, here's how you early vote. If it's in New York, for example, that means, like, you have to change your primary, you have to change your party identification a year before a primary in order to vote in that primary election. It's like one of the most restrictive in the country. So you have to help manage people, help them understand how to do that. So whatever it is, it's just like education is the first step to make it easier. And that's our fallback, that is. So we are now helping set the standard. A way we see it is now we are setting the standard of what the election experience should feel like. And we can then work with states to try to rise them up to the level of experience that TurboVote is setting. So if this is the new standard and we're able to sort of do it as a user interface layer on top of the voting system, we can then make that the gold standard without actually needing to have found a state or a county to implement that gold standard first. Because that's usually how policy change works. You find a best case actor, and then you get them up to what you want to be, and you use them as your shining city on a hill. So we wanted to do that without even needing to find the state or county to do that with us first. And then the second was, how do we then make this the status quo technology that states can use everywhere? So like, if this is, how do we get states up to this level? And that was much harder, as you can imagine. So we started that journey in 2013. We did a 7-month ethnographic study of election administration offices. So in every state, there is an election director who actually determines what technology is being used in the state. And then the counties are the ones who actually run the elections. So it's one of the most complex policy environments because there's like no federal levers really at all. It's like, according to the Constitution, like states run elections. And so we studied them first to make sure that we were aligned on mission. And we found that election clerks, administrators, we were afraid that their top priority was going to be making their own lives easier. But we learned that when they innovated, they were always adopting innovations to serve voters better. And so one, it was just like, great, like we can actually understand the interests of these people in elections and make sure what we're building is something they would use. And then we discovered that they do basically one innovation every 2 years because they shut everything down in election cycles to make sure that they don't screw it up. And so we were able to map like, okay, this is when we can push forward innovations. But our strategy really was, don't push legislative change in these states. Find the key administrator, and by providing them with new technology, they could actually change policy through the voting experience that they're able to provide. And so the first place where that really was proved out was with polling place data. So you can now, in every state, Google to find your polling place. And that wasn't done through legislative change. So the way we did that is by working with state election director offices, convincing the election director that it's in their interest for their voters to be able to Google for this information, and then building the tools that made it possible for them to do that. So we now have in 46 states a designated person in the election director office who knows how to upload polling place data to us and then use our quality assurance tools to make sure that the polling place data is accurate, and then we'll upload it from there to Google. And so it was a way where sort of technology was another way forward without needing to move through legislature. And now we're moving to the states to try and do three new things. The first thing is ballot tracking. So a lot more states are voting by mail, but no one is really tracking those ballots. And we think that pushing to vote at home is really good for democracy. If you do it well, it increases participation, but it also allows voters to vote with more information because they're voting, like they can ask people questions about who's on the ballot, they can like Google things, and whereas like a polling place is sort of an information isolation box. So anyway, by helping track ballots, we can help people feel that that is a reliable way to vote. And we now work with, we sold that as a technology to Virginia, Oregon, and New Jersey. So we now have 3 states where, again, we weren't pushing policy as legislative change, but as like selling a service to an election director and making something possible. And the newest technology we have, which will get a bit to the question in the forum about why we don't vote online. So we are now helping Colorado build out their audit software so that they can audit every election. And essentially, one of the big threats to our democracy right now is interference, hacking, and by building technology that makes it so cheap that you can audit every single election, you can actually make it possible for a policy regime where you say, let's just write a law that says audit every single election. And so the technology that makes that possible, then that would be an impossible law. And so you can also make new types of policies possible by figuring out, how to do it for a state. And that's what we're doing in Colorado now. So I feel like I'm getting the hand signal to move to Q&A. So this is probably a good place to pause, and then we'll go into more detail on everything.
Thanks, Seth. So a lot of things around like soft power to move towards policy change through, we often think of like legislative policy change, but there's many ways to do it. So with that, I want to make sure. So yeah, let's move to Q&A. Are there any questions people want to start surfacing?
I mostly, it's Paula. Hi, Seth. This is a really great idea, really good. And while you were talking, I signed up for it, so I want to see how it works. The one thing I want to just sort of add to the discussion is a comment on one of your observations that politicians aren't interested in getting out the vote, because I found that's not the case. And the reason I want to mention that to you is there might be some other allies that you might have. Although I know you do want to be nonpartisan, this is about getting votes out. But I will say it's very well known how low voter turnout is among politicians, and it's something that's talked about quite a bit and something that a lot of people are trying to address. So having information in our hands is clearly important. But I will just say, I'll illustrate it by one. I could give you two examples, but I'll just give you one. So I mentioned that I worked at City Hall with Mayor Villaraigosa, so I was very close to him for a number of years, but also with his recent campaign for governor. And he didn't do well because there's historically low voter turnout among Latino voters and people in Los Angeles. So this was a very, and those were his key constituencies, LA voters and Latino voters. So this was written about in the newspapers quite a bit. And there are a lot of folks who work on getting people interested to vote. For those populations, and I want to focus on Latino voters, which are a growing part of our population, particularly in California, but in a lot of states, and have historically low voter turnout. They're at around 18%, which is even lower than average. Like the voter, I think you know the statistics. There's a different issue, which is their interaction with government is not a relationship they trust very well. So the idea of registering to vote is a hurdle to overcome. And there are lots of folks who work on that. So part of your model is getting information in the hands of, it looks like engaged voters, but there's that sweep of the larger population that has different issues with accessing government services and so forth. It's pretty key.
Yeah, so let me address that, Paul. So I would say for me, it's not that I didn't think no politicians would solve this, but when I was starting this in 8 years ago, I wanted to make sure I had a strategy that didn't rely on politics working in order to succeed. Because I feel like if that was all it took, it would have been done already. Because it's just, this is now I remember in 1994 when Oregon moved to all vote by mail voting, and they've had enormous success with it afterwards. And I assume that like by 20 years later, we'd have awesome voting around the country. But now it's Washington, Colorado, and California just passed it. And so my feeling was that the way our democracy is too dysfunctional to rely on that solely as a strategy. So yes, I agree. And when there are allies, when there are people in democracy who want to make democracy stronger, that's awesome. And then we hopefully can give them tools that they can work with. Yeah. And so there's more that's possible for them. But I would say that our strategy is not to engage the most engaged voters. About 35% of TurboVote are sort of Spanish as a first language users. And that's partly through our partnerships. So we can also, through TurboVote, make it possible for new types of entities to do really effective campaigns. So in 2016, we helped power Univision's major voter engagement effort. And that's one of the reasons why we focus so much on building out the platform in Spanish as well. But
good. That's great.
Yeah, but now our main strategy is actually to try and embed TurboVote in the attention economy so that when you are just a normal person going on Facebook or going on like Twitter or Instagram, you will see a prompt. Everyone will see a prompt that there's a registration deadline or an election, because most people who are not engaged are not going to Google, help me register to vote. Right. Like it needs to be brought to them. So yeah, I definitely am sympathetic to that.
Well, it's good to know about it. I didn't want to assume one way or the other, but I think it's just such a persistent issue that so many people are grappling with, the Latino vote and also immigrant votes, and then the millennial vote, because there's a strong sense of that there's apathy among millennials. So I like how you phrase it as the attention economy, which is where the millennials spend a lot of their time. So that's a great way to do it. It was just an observation. I don't know if you have questions on that. It sounds like you don't. So I will mute.
I just made a note of attention economy here. It's a great term.
Yeah, it's good to know for all of our issues, we're not competing with another issue, another organization. You're competing with Facebook, like you're competing with like Netflix.
Yeah, it's true. It's very true. And that's a smart strategy for that. I was thinking as I was listening to you that this is perfect for millennials, perfect for college students who are just out on their own and finally, and needing to be guided through a lot of these processes. And that's a really important demographic for voting.
Steve? And do feel free to just chime in. Y'all don't need to. Feel free to go for it. But yeah, Steve.
Seth, I was the one who posed the question to you about voting online. What's the major obstacle to that, and why aren't we doing that yet?
Great. I will try to not nerd out on this question too much.
Nerd out, my brother.
There's two main reasons. One is I like to ask like why you can bank online, but you can't vote online. There's a key difference between banking and voting, and it is that banking is not anonymous, and money is like fungible. So like they know exactly, the bank knows every button you're pushing. They know who you are, that you logged in, and they can, if they're hacked, they're just numbers on a page. Whereas with voting, it needs to be secure like a bank is. It needs to be verifiable like a bank is, but it also needs to be anonymous. And that additional layer of anonymity makes the technology really hard. And so some people think that they have invented ways to do it using blockchain. My fear, though, is that we're most vulnerable not to an actual hack, but to a psyops attack where people believe that we have been hacked, where there's you just claim that the election was hacked, and people lose faith in our democracy, that an election loses legitimacy. And so my biggest fear is, even if we move to an online voting system that was secure, people would believe that it was hacked, and there'd be no way to convince them otherwise. And so right now, what I really promote is exactly what California is moving to, and that Colorado modeled, and it's called a voter services model, where you do basically everything at once. You automatically mail ballots to every voter, and then you also allow voters to either mail them back in or let them vote in person at any polling place in the state, whether it's near home or work. And you have same-day registration, so people can just show up if they missed a registration deadline, while also giving a chance to sort of register online or automatically register them. So it's just like taking it from a design perspective, like taking a user-centered approach, which is like, what would be the easiest, what would be the most way that fits the way we live now to do voting, but also use paper to make sure there's always a paper trail.
Okay, thanks for that.
That might connect to my question, which is about like internet access, or just like in rural settings where, technology might not be as prevalent, or, just good internet access might still be an issue. I wonder if you run into that and any kind of unique solutions for that.
From our perspective, it's really just to build mobile first, to imagine that your users are accessing the technology through a mobile phone, a smartphone, because that's usually the primary means of getting on the internet, like whether you're rural or anywhere in the country. Like lots of people are on Facebook who like don't have a computer. But honestly, I don't have much more than that. I would just say that that's probably, I think, ultimately why we try to work in partnership with election directors and county clerks, because they know that their mission is to help everyone vote, not just everyone who has internet access. And so like, it's one of the reasons why, like, again, online voting or other things like that, you can't sort of get ahead of the, depending on the state, like 5 to 20% of an electorate that could be affected. But yeah, I don't have, I don't work on broadband issues directly, so we are limited by that.
Seth, can you talk a little bit about how you, what interactions you've had with advocacy organizations that would love to, use the kind of activation channel to activate their own members? I know that they're having been involved in California party politics a little bit. There are methods of doing voter registration. Of course, you can't do sort of in-person voter registration in a partisan way. You have to register everybody. At the same time, there are many abuses of that by partisans. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you've interacted with those groups and what you plan for your tools in the future for those groups.
Cool, great. I mean, I'll say, first of all, when I thought you were going to say advocacy, our space is relatively full. There are lots of really great organizations doing this work. And so we also made the strategic decision to not be an advocacy organization working on voting rights because there were already many powerful organizations doing it. We wanted to be their partners who were working directly with election directors. And so I would just say in any of your spaces, I find it is really helpful to have an ecosystem approach where like we couldn't work with the states and with a Facebook, for example, or a Google if we were also suing the states. And like similarly, if you're suing the states, then you can't turn Facebook into a big on-ramp for voting. So, but both are needed. But second though is like, yeah, so on TurboVote, we have like 3 different types of partners. So we have like around 120 colleges we work with around the country. And we try to bake TurboVote into like class registration or mandatory pre-semester check-in, or basically like an infrastructure process. Like this is like super unsexy, but like how do you turn everything into a DMV where you sort of go through and it signs you up? And we also have major tech companies we work with. Similarly, like how do you put TurboVote on the news feed for everyone around registration deadlines, which is happening right now, which is pretty cool. But then for our nonprofit partners, yeah, it's like, let's give them a new type of clipboard. So that when they are registering a voter, they also know, like, did they vote? Are they getting reminders to vote in all of their elections? But we do find that it's just harder in general as a strat. It's just a harder job to reach voters that way as a nonprofit, because our best tools are infrastructure plays where we bake TurboVote into a process that everyone has to go through, like a class registration or like being at the top of the news feed on Facebook. Because if you're going and you're targeting voters one at a time or marketing to them, it's just a harder strategy. So I don't have the next magic tool lined up for how to make their lives easier, but we work with a few, and they're doing great work. I guess I don't really have much more to add, but that we work with them, and I'm happy if you have specific nonprofits or advocacy groups to sort of take that offline too.
Cool, thanks.
I wonder if we could bring even some of other folks' policy goals into the room. Like what brought you to this huddle, and how soft power or infrastructure may come into the policy goals you're working towards.
Yeah, maybe I can jump back in. This is Cole again for those on audio. What we're doing is we're starting to, so to back up, Labor Voices we connect with workers in supply chains to make sure that workers are being treated fairly and companies can buy from those supply chains without concern about the ethical treatment of those workers. We've recently started to talk a bit more with policymakers about how this work touches on trade and labor policy. And we see that those are going to be some big issues in the next, probably in the next Congress, and maybe even in this one. So we've started to talk a little bit with policymakers about how the type of infrastructure we're building to monitor supply chains, to monitor sectors overseas, could be useful for U.S. policymakers as they adjust the trade and labor levers that they have at their disposal. So to some extent to a large extent, that policy sphere is relatively new to us. I come with a background in federal policy. I worked in the federal government for some time. So I have some exposure to that, but from the perspective of labor voices, it's pretty new. And so we're actively looking at how what are some best practices that folks are using to connect with policymakers and to influence policy in smart ways.
Sorry, are we sort of all sort of go around in a circle? Is that the huddle?
Just as folks want to chime in, I thought I saw Katrina lean forward if you want to.
Sure, but if you do need to respond first, Seth, that's fine too. I'll just say quickly, I think my project is about providing new options for the care of our dead, right? So new ways to care for specifically the physical bodies after we've died. And so I guess looking at right now feels like a little bit of a narrower definition of policy, where we're kind of, first of all, mapping the state by the state regulations around the care of our bodies after we die, and more broadly like funeral direction, and trying specifically to start by changing policy here in Washington State to add an option for families, and then trying to then looking more broadly okay, how do we either replicate that change or tear down the whole system? So yeah, that's why I'm here. It's a little bit more of a narrow tactic, I guess, but certainly we haven't figured out the strategy for the long term.
Sounds great. And I thought I'd throw mine out there too, and which is related in some ways to what you all are doing in terms of, and what Seth was mentioning too about partnering with policymakers. We take that approach too in trying to convert urban paved school grounds into park-like environments. There's health issues and design issues and education policy, school board policy, state level policies that all intersect with our work. And we've been seeking out partnerships with those who are in charge of policies that are not usually things that the public votes on directly. It's things that, like the state architect might decide internally, is a regulation that requires or doesn't require trees, or something specific that goes down the rabbit hole on something that actually affects 10,000 schools in the state. And so we're looking to make those shifts, and we're finding that for us, we're finding great traction among the policymakers who are interested in our information. What's hard for us is to be able to afford our time to be able to do that, because we don't have a product like a voter registration system that we might be able to, the economic model of policy change, I'd say, for our own organization is what we're struggling with, to be able to have the time to do that and the staff power to be in the right place at the right time consistently. And when we've approached foundations, they all say, or the ones we've talked to thus far, oh, we like systemic change, but we don't work on policy. And so we're kind of trying to find that niche, I would say, and also on that kind of soft power theme. We work what I've been calling, to myself anyway, the Tai Chi of policy change. I don't need to make the force that's massively moving in this direction. I just need to move it 5 degrees to get it to point to take that, harness that power and that motion that's already in effect and shift it to the goal I'm working on. And that might be, in California, there's a huge policy push toward climate mitigation. Climate change related policy work has a great backing of thousands of people, but none of it's focused on children's impact of climate on children. And so we're trying to shift some of this massive conversation to benefit kids. And so when we partner with those organizations, we're just trying to get that to veer slightly as one of our strategies, I would say. So those are kind of the range of things, but mostly we're struggling with how do you pay for your time to do these things when you don't have a product of that sort.
I can jump in, but I'm actually curious to hear the answer to that question.
Should we maybe do those in bunches? I feel like if we do more than 3, I'll
Yeah.
Seth, take it away.
Yeah. Here are all of your answers. No, it's so let's lower some expectations on that. Yeah. I mean, those are all really hard problems. I mean, all of you honestly are here because you're going to be the ones who innovate on finding the solution to them. But I can say that for me, one of the useful tools in our tool belt has been not branding ourselves as a policy group. This is one of the few times I even have that word associated with our organization is this Huddle. Because I actually find that it's all good. I actually find that you actually have more authority if you are someone who helps administer a policy, because you're not seen as like lobbying or forcing someone to do something. And you have more authority as an expert if you're seen as an innovator than a policymaker. And all of you as Ashoka fellows can lean into your social entrepreneur brand, which I think sets you apart from other people trying to advocate on policy, because people talk to them all the time. So I would say even Sharon, specifically for your case, there's an organization in our space, the Center for Civic Design, which does a great job of basically consulting with states, including in California, on their ballots, where they are basically design consultants. So they are able to create change by consulting on the implementation of policies, and through that, help shape the policies in the best direction that they can. And that's probably a closer model to what you're working on.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I don't know, Katrina and Cole, I feel like your model maybe is a little bit more similar to what we're doing, in that you're not setting yourself up in an antagonistic way to any people in positions of power. You're trying to directly either present an alternative, and I think your words, Katrina or Cole, like you're trying to present a new model of how they could do things. And in those cases, I do think it makes sense to have a advocacy partner. And I try to set up like monthly half-hour calls with 2 to 4 people in our ecosystem, just to help be an ecosystem coordinator, because any space can become sort of oddly competitive. And I find that just staying in close touch with a few leaders without overwhelming your schedule can actually align groups well in a way that a big conference call doesn't. That's just been my experience.
Yeah, I think somebody might have, I don't know, Brandon, if you had a question, I don't want to jump in, but I was going to build on that, because what Seth is doing is really brilliant and important from a voter engagement standpoint, which, me having been in office where, deal with public policy as well as voter engagement is separate and very distinct and managed very distinctly from policy, and must be, because it must be nonpartisan in terms of effort. So there's lots of groups that I'm still involved with just because I care about, the electoral process and civic participation, that deal with voter engagement with a whole different strategy than policy. And you're wise to keep it separate. The thing that I find really compelling about what you're doing is you're building the partnerships on the ground, because that makes it very solid in terms of making sure you reach folks. And a lot of the concern in voter engagement is, as I mentioned before, the Latino population is a strong example, but there's a lot of other disenfranchised communities that don't vote so much. So having a strategy to figure out how to reach those disenfranchised communities and trust your system is the most important. I mean, Steve and I were talking over the last week about how African Americans vote in large numbers. Steve, I'll let you speak to that, but largely through the organizational structure of churches. So whatever the ecosystems are, it's important to tap into. And if that's, I don't know where your points are, where you're feeling you need more help or not, but that is really critical, which I know you know already, and it's good to hear about it.
Well, we are always looking for trusted partners to use our clipboard, basically.
Seth, man, you're doing wonderful work, and thank you for the work that you're doing. One of the things that we're trying to do is increase the participation of those African Americans and Hispanics that go to churches. They go to church, and she's right. African American community is one of the highest demographic groups who vote. And one of the things that we're trying to do is transform not only the fact that you vote, but also move that into the direction of actual participation in issues. For example, we're working with a group in Texas called Texas Appleseed. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before. And one of the issues that they work on, and they've been very successful at, is the school to prison pipeline. So what I'm doing, I'm going into these churches, and we're continuing to organize them, but with this aim in mind. You know, when the legislature meets during the legislative session, one of the things that we want to do is move those congregations from the congregational level and the street level into those hearing rooms. Because many times when they go and give testimony, the seats behind them are empty. And Texas Appleseed actually identified that if they could have more members from the community, particularly African American churches and Hispanic churches, show up in those hearing rooms, that they can move policy a lot easier. And not only that, if we can get those ministers also, you know, to occupy that testimonial seat and give testimony as to the different issues that they're interested in, that would also help move the issue too. So ministers speaking, and not only with them speaking, but with them congregations in tow as well. So increasing those voter numbers will help us move the legislation that we're interested in.
That's great. That's important work. You're pursuing what I consider to be one of the hardest models because it's very effective, but it's really difficult. I'm not sure if I have much to offer in the way of advice, to be honest. I think.
Well, here's my question: what can we do, being that African Americans are already, you know, one of the highest demographics who vote? What are some other strategies do you think we can employ to increase that?
That's a great question. I mean, so for me, I think of voting as a really complicated behavior. It's like partly rational, it's like partly social, it's partly habitual. Mm-hmm. And the like rational in that, like, you know, the perceived benefit should be higher than the cost, so like make it easier. And like social in that you're more likely to do it if it's what your community does or if it's what your family taught you to do. And habitual in that, like, if you're a young person, you vote twice in a row, you'll vote your whole life. And it helps them become a part of your identity that you're a voter. And I think that for communities that already vote at high rates, like the Black community, that there is potentially culture work that could be done with that outside of the Black community. And I'm not sure, honestly, it's not my area of work doing culture work, but I would say, for example, that for me, focusing more on voting in local elections in addition to federal elections is important, because that helps lead to the culture shift and voter identity, where people aren't just voting in an election because, oh, this one is important because this person has to win. You actually want to shift away from that and towards a model where people vote because they're a voter. Like, it's their identity that they're a voter. And that's when you start seeing, I think, the cultural effects in a community where people feel their power more and feel like the representatives at every level are more responsive. But
you answered the question. I got a nugget from you.
Okay,
you know,
all right.
Local elections are very important, even though that percentage may be high in a particular local election, but the high may be 25%.
Right,
compared to other demographics. So if we could take it to 50 in a local level and just get people used to doing that and establishing an identity and a routine of doing that, we could probably enhance that in other elections. I like that idea. I really do.
Great. Oh, good. I'm glad I was able to have some useful nugget for.
You did, my brother.
Y'all, we are already we've got about 10 minutes left. So I wonder if we could do one more round of just like rapid fire questions. I know Brandon, you had leaned in earlier. Just other things that are kind of still floating that people might want to grab onto before we close out this part of the conversation.
I was just going to say, I mean, we're an organization just kind of trying to think through our policy role. I'm actually curious, just real quick, like the term soft power, what does that actually mean?
Great. So for me, I think of that as persuasion. So like the difference between power and persuasion is the way I think about that. So, sometimes a politician will do something because they're going to get kicked out of office if they don't. That's just hard power. But other times in our world, when we talk to an election director, we're talking to them about how, for example, sending text messages to all their voters is just going to decrease costs in their office. It's going to lead to a better voter experience, and it would let you be a policy leader. And then the lever we're using, so there's persuasion, and then the lever we're using is, and we can help you do it. Like we have the technology to help you do it, so it's not that difficult. And so you can lower the cost of needing to persuade someone to do something by making it easier for them. And that's sort of what I mean by soft power.
Interesting.
But it can mean lots of different things. Honestly, it's a super flexible term. So you could also use it to mean that you have good relationships with all the key decision makers, and you put in the time to build those relationships. You don't have power over them, but you can get a meeting. They trust you. That's soft power. Or it can mean that you've set yourself up as the expert in doing what you're doing. And so anytime a state or a county wants to implement something similar, they know to call you and get your advice. And that's also a form of soft power.
There's a couple of questions from Kara that I wanted to channel in because she's having some audio issues. The first, I think you'll see this in the chat.
Oh yeah, I do.
Yeah, some learning of reference materials and to influence the policy agenda, and then how you measure that you're having an actual impact on the policy agenda. How are you tracking that kind of thing?
I think that. What are some? Sorry, I can see here. Reference materials you can recommend for affecting the policy. I unfortunately don't have any of those. We're honored to have the Kennedy School did a case study on us, and that is maybe a reference you can share out. I realize it's behind a paywall though, but unfortunately, and it was more about this high level decision to do soft power versus hard power as a strategy. I don't have a great reference guide, to be honest. And for us, evaluating our work is really just measuring the proliferation of best practices. And I don't believe that I have found a good methodology. So that is one that I would love to see if one of you has a better methodology to use. For us, the secret has been honestly just building close relationships with funders so that they understand our strategy and aren't looking for a really cookie cutter report on it, but that they're in the weeds enough through regular communication that they trust that we're moving it forward without needing that methodology.
Is there a methodology out there that tracks that you know about?
I've seen one. I'm looking for a reference. Yeah.
I'm sure there are tons. I'm just not an expert on it.
Okay.
If
I don't know, Sharon, I saw you nodding. Is there one you wanted to?
Yeah, someone referred one to me recently, and I'm looking for the link so I can share it with you. It was from a foundation. It was really good. Let me just check it out. But it was measuring policy change when because a lot of, for at least the foundation proposals, they do, ask these, how do you know you've made the shift? And it was more about measuring impact over time. So let me see if I can find it. And I haven't read it recently though, so it's not, can't list the points off the top of my head, unfortunately.
So like I'd say just in our example, for example, with the proliferation of ballot place data, like we just like every 2 years, it's like number of states that are now sharing ballot data with us. It was very simple. And then like for each state, how many were on a ladder of engagement towards now sharing ballot data, also doing polling place data for local elections. So we just developed a very specific, like, I don't know if you're working at, like, if it's states, then it's like you have 50 states and there's a ladder of engagement for each. So it was a very simple model where we were trying to move each state up that ladder and illustrating it.
So measuring policy change is the next huddle, maybe.
I would say one of my big challenges, honestly, and I'm sure most of you are experiencing this, is it's really hard to prove your impact for funders in the way that they want with like your randomized control trials at the same time as it is being an entrepreneur and actually getting the work done. And they don't fund you enough to do both of those things well simultaneously in almost all cases. And so this is what I meant about building good funder relationships is like the ability to have that honest conversation, which is like setting expectations with funders about like what they should expect from you in terms of reporting for the amount of resources and capacity that you have is an important conversation to have up front. Because you could say, listen, this is the capacity I have. This is what I can get you. I feel like that's a good leading indicator. And if we want to do more, this is what it's going to cost to get there. Because in almost all of your cases, I think leading indicators are fine because you're also trying to build that shining city on a hill as the first stage in your strategy, like, make the proof point.
Can I just jump in on that? Because I know somebody who does voter engagement for the public interest networks, and I heard some numbers on what it costs per voter. So it's something like $25 per knock on a door. So if that's a comparative statistic, right, that's could be helpful because I think you.
Yeah, no. So and we do have that, and we'll have like millions of voters. I really argue against using some of those with funders because I think in my field it ends up incentivizing away from systemic change, where it just incentivizes you to get as many voters through the door of a specific federal election versus create systems that turn people into regular voters. And so like when I'm advocating actually to our funder community that they try to track the sort of active voter participation rate of voters you engage with. How many of their elections over the course of the year, every year, did they vote in? Instead of just, because right now it's overly focused on federal elections in a way that I think shifts our whole culture away from local elections and like democracy that's actually near the human level, sort of. Yeah. Anyway, no, I agree. It is a metric that is
I mean, I think you could use it as you're more efficient than that. Is what my point was.
Yeah, we
as
could.
a benchmark, you could say this is what they spend. It's very labor intensive, and we're more efficient.
Where we are, yeah.
Well, the piece that I just posted a piece that was, I'm not sure it was the one I was looking for, but it's one that gets at part of this, which is figuring out what piece of the impact is yours, and looking at collective impact. How does a field shifting? And so this document I just posted is called when collective impact has an impact. And so it's kind of a case study, I think, model, but that may not be the one I was looking for, but it has some related measurement discussion in it. We'll see if I can find the other one as well.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in that we've had to push back on folks, either customers or funders, at various times when they ask for like RCT or randomized control trial type of proof points. And so happy to help others figure out how to push back as well, because it's particularly when you're innovating, when you're changing your tools very rapidly, it just doesn't, from a mathematical sense, it just doesn't make sense. Even if you had all the resources at your disposal. So there are some ways of pushing back on that, and like you said, aiming at more leading indicators, Seth, and hypothesis generation versus this kind of RTT type approach.
Seth, I have a quick question.
Go for it.
What's driving this low turnout in voting? Is it apathy, or have people just totally lost faith in the system?
The good news is that, good news depending on how you see it, is that process is a huge part of it. It is, in 2012, it was 50% of non-participants were a collection of like a dozen process issues. And then in other elections, it's less. But for me, it's the low-hanging fruit. And I think if you solve the process problems, it engages enough people to help then solve the apathy problems.
Interesting. Okay.
Y'all, we've got Cole jumping, and I know we're at the end of the hour. So does it feel good to wrap here?
Yeah.
All right. Lots of big questions open and some resources that are coming through. As a follow-up, we'll be sending a share back of all these kind of nuggets that came out, as well as the recording. But thank you all for joining, and thank you to Seth for hosting this huddle.
Thanks, Seth. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you.
I want to give the closing words to you, especially if there's any voter turnout exclamations you want to have. Take it away.
No, I was just going to say that it's an honor to give advice to a group of Ashoka fellows, because I know you all are leaders in your field and doing great work, and that there's a lot I could learn from all of you as well. So hopefully I'll be joining one of your huddles next.
For sure. And don't forget to vote, y'all. All right.
Exactly. Don't forget to vote. Everyone sign up for Turbo Vote and you'll get your reminders.
I just did.
Thank you, Paula.